Hi, I'm Christina Smith. I work as the maker educator at Science City, but I'm also in the test kitchen team. You're in my home kitchen today, and we're going to be testing bread in a bag 2 ways. We'll be trying it 2 ways using the scientific method to figure out which yeast is going to yield the best bread with this recipe. So stay tuned to figure out what you're going to need and which bread is going to make the best one.
So here we have our ingredients. We also have them in metric on the Instructables. We'll be using a kitchen scale just to make sure that each bag has exactly the same amount of ingredients in each. We'll be mixing up our dry first with 1 cup of flour, our sugar, as well as our yeast. We'll be mixing it up in the bag just to make sure that it's consistent before we add anything wet inside. Now it's time for the 1 cup of warm water. Once we add that, we let it sit for 10 minutes. Now we'll be melting our butter with our salt. For our salt, it called for 7 grams, which is exactly 1 teaspoon, which worked out well. Now we're going to add that into our dough with 1 more cup of flour and mix that around well. Now it's time to prepare our baking loaf. We're using parchment paper to make it easier to remove at the end, but you could grease it if you prefer to use oil or butter. It's time for our last cup of flour. We're going to tip that out onto our table and then mix up our doughs onto it. The consistency is the most important part here. The active dry only needed 1 teaspoon more, where the instant yeast needed 4.5 teaspoons just to create the right consistency. It should be tacky but be able to pull itself away from the table and your hands. You'll see it's time for it to rise for the last time. We'll be putting it in our loaf pan and setting it aside in a warm part of the kitchen. It took us 45 minutes to double in size, but if you have a warm kitchen, it might only mean 30 minutes. It's doubled in size now and ready to go in the oven. At 375, it goes in for 25 to 30 minutes. Each of ours took 30 minutes to get this nice crust and to sound hollow inside. Now we're going to cut it. With a serrated knife, this is easiest. You can see there's a nice crumb inside. When we push on it, it doesn't turn back into dough and it springs back. Each one turned out very well. Surprisingly, the only difference was needing more flour.
So here we are at the end of the experiment. What did we learn? The active dry yeast is a lot more aerated, but proved well. The instant yeast also proved well, slightly denser air pockets, but it did take more flour to get to the right consistency before the bake. Otherwise though, each bread looks very good, and both yeasts are legitimate choices for this bread recipe. It might not be the case for every recipe you find, but for this one, feel comfortable using either one.